The Barguest is a fascinating creature, most often found in the folklore of northern England. Folklorist William Henderson noted the Barguest tales covered Northumberland, Durham and Yorkshire. That said, some appearances also crop up in Lancashire and Cumbria. Now, in many tales, the Barguest was most popularly a death omen, and in a most fitting way, Sir Walter Scott thought the name came from bahrgeist, or spirit of the bier, as in the bier on which a corpse was carried. Now, we have covered the Barguest before on Fabulous Folklore, albeit in passing, when we looked at black dog folklore. But this time, we're going to look at them as an aspect of fairy lore, since there's a lot of dispute about what Barguests actually are. So if you're curious if they're a spectral hound or a type of fairy, then make sure that you listen to this week's episode of Fabulous Folklore. Hello there and welcome to Fabulous Folklore, the podcast for all things folklore, occult and just a bit weird. I'm your host Icy Sedgwick, blogger, fantasy author and your guide into these rather mysterious realms. I've got some rare things to show you, so come on in, take a look around, but be careful not to touch anything. These things sometimes bite. Well, hello there and welcome back to Fabulous Folklore with me, your host, Icy Sedgwick. I do hope that everybody survived Friday the 13th yesterday, although obviously please do remember there is an episode about why Friday the 13th is nothing to worry about. So there we go. Anyway, we're just going to crack on because I'm not really sure how interested anybody ever really is in the various preambles and what have you. So we'll just jump into it. Now, we are doing different types of fairy in this particular month's theme, but they're an interesting way of looking at fairies because obviously fairies you probably think like gossamer wings and dancing around and, you know, the kind of famous Cottingley fairy style of imagery. But obviously it's quite an umbrella term, and there have been some really interesting discussions, most notably with Morgan Daimler on Twitter, about the category of fairy, and quite a lot of things do fit under it. So that's why we're looking at creatures that aren't necessarily what you would consider fairies in the traditional sense of the word, but they do fall under that kind of fairy type heading, if that makes sense. Obviously when we looked at the Silky last week, that was a little bit of a boundary hopping creature as well, because is Silky a ghost, is she a fairy, is she both? And I think that's the thing you need to have with folklore sometimes, a both and mentality, that it's not necessarily an either or binary like that. Sometimes things can be sort of sitting in two categories at once, and the Barguest is another one that pretty much blurs these boundaries and distinctions. And what the Barguest actually is does appear to be quite a source of contention even among the people who write about them. Now, Catherine Briggs describes the Barguest in her 1976 Dictionary of Fairies as a bogey beast, assigning it horns, claws, teeth and fiery eyes. And obviously, as I mentioned in the introduction, William Henderson lists it among the local sprites of his folklore compendium from 1879. So again, we're sort of set up that whereabouts it's found even in these books would indicate it's a fairy. And as we've already covered, they were often considered a death omen. So one Barguest in particular apparently haunted a piece of wasteland between Reghorn and Headingley Hill near Leeds above a spring called the Oxwells. Now straight away I'm starting to think, oh hang on, is it entirely possible that it was actually some form of land spirit instead? But that's another discussion for another time. Because if anyone important died in the area, this particular Barguest appeared and took the form of a large black dog with huge flaming eyes. It then led a procession of all the dogs in the area through the neighbourhood, and they would all be howling and barking and everything as they went along. And if anyone got in their way, the Barguest would strike the person with their paw, and any Barguest inflicted wound would never heal. Now, Henderson relates that a man from Yorkshire told him about the Barguest, having seen the procession as a child, and apparently the procession had happened before the death of the local squire, thereby giving it this sense of an omen rather than giving it a celebratory function. Now, the Barguest is also something of a shapeshifter, because a Barguest that apparently haunted the area near Darlington shifted forms between a black dog, a white cat or rabbit, a headless woman and a headless man who disappeared in a flash of flame. And I think that if you're going to make an exit quickly, that is a really good way to do it. But obviously, if you've got all these different types of forms that are really different, it's unclear how people knew that all of these forms were the same Barguest. So it's a pity that Henderson doesn't go into more detail, but that is indeed how he refers to them. So where does the name Barguest comes from? Obviously, in the introduction, I mentioned the bahrgeist option from Sir Walter Scott, which is the spirit of the bier idea. But Reverend William Carr actually gives two definitions of the name in his glossary of the Yorkshire dialect, and it's spelt both Barguest, as in Barghest, and Barguest, as in the guest of a hotel, and he describes it as being a sprite that haunts towns and populated places. He actually considers it a Belgian word from berg and geest, or ghost. Now, William Hone disagreed that it meant a spirit of towns or populated places in his table book from 1838, and in his reasoning, berg means hill, it's actually mountain, but we won't split hairs, so the Barguest becomes a sprite that frequents hills and small villages. He also theorised that it came from bier, the German word for bear, and apparently this explained why the spirit took the form of either a bear or large dog. Hone also takes his evidence from the fact that Craven region has a village called Barden, which he translates as the bear's den. So to him this means bears were common in the area in earlier times, except none of the accounts that I've come across, albeit second-hand accounts that other people are repeating, nobody mentions it looking like a bear. So just bear that in mind. Pardon the pun. But Hone also refers to the creature as a spectral hound, probably through the derivation of geist or ghost to guest. But it's interesting that both Carr and Henderson classify the Barguest as a sprite, which, like I said earlier, puts them into the realm of fairies, and Encyclopaedia Britannica actually describes it as a goblin dog. And indeed, Briggs including the Barguest in her Encyclopedia of Fairies demonstrates just how slippery the category can actually be. And then we checked the newspapers. So obviously I headed over to British Newspaper Archives for this one. And someone wrote to the Teesdale Mercury to explain the meaning of the name, sort of in response to somebody else mentioning it in an earlier story. And I couldn't find the story, but I found a letter in response to it. So there we go. But as much as this letter writer repeated the same explanations that we've already covered, they also noted that in Northumberland, people actually referred to it as the brag. And further, they suggested bahrgeist as a meaning of spirit of the town or village, following Carr's suggestion. Now to them, the Barguest fell under the sprite and demon categories at the same time, though noted it was, and I quote, much given to practical joking, though its freaks are usually more mischievous than dangerous, end quote. And to me, I think the idea of practical jokes probably puts it more in the sprite category than the demonic. Now, in 1901, Anthony Whitehead described the Barguest as, and I quote, a spirit known only through the sense of hearing, end quote. And apparently it, quote, disturbed the last generations of Westmoreland with its awful howling, end quote. FHW wrote to the Whitby Gazette in 1906 to add an extra explanation, and they focused on the bar in the name to refer to a gate, as in the bar across a turnpike. Now that would make sense in its appearances on common highways, although few stories actually reference them as being turnpike roads. In the same letters column, 60 Years Resident wrote a letter to add that the Barguest was a common story in Whitby some 60 years or so earlier, putting the tales in the early 19th century. Apparently the Barguest was commonly seen in Church Street. Now in Whitby it looked like a white pig, and seeing it was an omen of death in the family of the person who saw it. It walked along the street, and if someone walked on the pavement, it would force them towards the wall, but if you walked in the road, it followed you until you reached a lonely part of the road, whereupon it disappeared, and no one knew where it went to when it vanished. T.T. Wilkinson noted meeting witnesses that described the Barguest in, I quote, the form of a white cow or horse, but on most occasions Trash is described as having the appearance of a large dog, end quote. And here both Trash and Skriker are local names from Burnley bestowed upon the Barguest. But again, it's quite interesting to have it that rather than being a black dog, we've now had a white pig and a white cow or horse. Now, Wilkinson described the Barguest as making a splashing sound while walking, and like the Whitby version, foretold death in the family of the person who saw it. This version was apparently largely invisible, though it uttered dreadful screams when it was invisible, which is presumably how people knew it was there. And so many of the stories do refer to it as being invisible, but then they quite confidently also give it a form as well, which I think is quite an interesting little paradox there. But if you followed this particular Barguest, it would walk backwards while staring at you, and it vanished if you looked away for even a second. People reported trying to strike it but never making contact with it. And again, Wilkinson refers to the Barguest as a sprite, and I think a lot about the behaviour that he describes does really sound quite fairy-like and mischievous, in much the same way that we get these kind of antics from Silky that we heard last week. Now, a letter to a member of the Kendal Natural History and Scientific Society described a Barguest in Kendal in Cumbria as appearing as a pig that rattled chains. Another appeared in French Lane, again as a pig, but this time with eyes like saucers. And yet a third wandered around the marketplace. This third one is of most interest as it took, and I quote, the form of a headless lady dressed in white and having a tankard tied round her waist, end quote. Again, how did they know they were all the Barguest? But there we go. Now, all of these are sort of quite short comments in passing, as I say, that people wrote to the newspaper. And what's quite interesting is there was actually quite a long encounter related to William Hone in this 1838 table book by a man referred to as Billy B. While Hone preserved the dialect as it was, I have taken the liberty of shortening the account and also updating it so as to make it more accessible to 21st century audiences who perhaps aren't necessarily that familiar with 19th century Yorkshire dialect. But there we go. So Billy had been out drinking at Grassington, and he was at pains in his story to relate that he was far from being drunk, and he was fully aware of all that went on around him throughout everything that happened in this story. So he left at around 11 p.m. and noted that it was a beautiful night at the end of the year, and the moon was very bright, so bright that he mentioned he'd never seen Rylstone Fell plainer in his life. So it's very important that he keeps letting us know how bright and easy everything was to see. He heard something pass him, and it made a brushing sound accompanied by rattling chains, though he saw nothing. Billy possessed his wits enough to know something strange was afoot. He paused to look around, but still saw nothing. Crucially, the sound fell silent too. Billy set off once more, and the sound resumed, and it seemed that the sound stopped whenever he did. At this point, he realised the creature to be a Barguest. He knew that they couldn't cross water, which you do sometimes come across in the stories, so he hurried on towards the wooden bridge ahead of him. He crossed, but the sound continued to accompany him. Billy assured Hone that the Barguest either crossed the bridge as well, or somehow made a trip of 30 miles around the Spring's Head in the blink of an eye. So while Billy had felt fear earlier, he suddenly felt a pang of bravery and decided to take a look at the Barguest. So he tried going up the bank, hearing the sound all the while, and still saw nothing. Finally, the sound stopped. So Billy thought, fair enough, it's wandered off, I'll go home. And he'd almost reached his door when the sound began again, this time heading away from him. So he followed the sound, and given the brightness of the moon, he finally saw the Barguest's tail. Happy that he'd finally seen it, he decided to go home after all. Though when he got there, something larger than a sheep sat blocking his door. It would neither get up nor move, so Billy picked up a stick to give it some motivation. It finally looked at him, displaying glowing eyes as big as saucers. He described the eyes as having a series of concentric rings from red to blue to white. And it didn't really have any pupils because these colour bands kind of just disappeared down to a dot. It grinned at him but still refused to move despite Billy's commands. Eventually his wife came to the door and the Barguest finally got up and wandered off. And Billy told Hone the Barguest must have been more afraid of his wife than it was of him, which I did quite like that little mention in the story. Billy told his wife what had happened, and his wife confirmed it sounded like a Barguest. Yet Billy was a lucky man, for he never saw the creature again. And I think this story is quite an interesting one because it's quite lengthy. And yes, it does essentially begin with, I had been drinking, but he's very much at pains of pointing out that he knew exactly what was going on and he had possession of all of his faculties. But the fact that he keeps referring to how bright it was is quite interesting, considering the fact that the Barguest essentially makes its presence felt through hearing. But anyway, I just love that little detail at the end about it basically getting up and wandering off when it hears his wife come at the door. Now, there is also another creature which sounds similar called the Padfoot, and some legends try to keep the Barguest and the Padfoot separate, but they do display similar behaviour, so I thought it was worth bringing in. And the Padfoot is most common around the villages near Leeds, and it is, and I quote, described as about the size of a small donkey, black, with shaggy hair and large eyes like saucers, and he follows people by night or waylays them in the road which they have to pass, end quote. Now, a Reverend C.G. Atkinson of Danby referred to the Padfoot as a death omen, a bit like the Barguest. Sometimes visible, sometimes invisible. It either padded along behind or beside people, so again people could hear it, and it might utter a roar completely unlike any known animal. Some stories described it as being bigger than a sheep with long smooth hair, which sounds a lot like Billy B's description. Yet unlike the Barguest, which is basically relatively harmless to you personally, Henderson noted the importance of leaving the Padfoot alone. Speaking to it or striking it actually gave it power over you. One man apparently kicked the Padfoot and ended up being dragged through a hedge and a ditch before being left under his window. Henderson suggests the Padfoot and the Barguest are one and the same, so it does make you wonder why the Padfoot has a little bit more of a tendency to do people harm, even if it's not fatally, where the Barguest seems to just kind of wind people up a little bit. But I did think that because the area in which they're seen overlaps and the fact they're both considered death omens, I thought that was quite an interesting little link between the two. So ultimately, what do we make of the Barguest? The differences in its description speak in some ways to the fluidity of the categories of fairy and ghost. And calling it a ghost doesn't really fit very well, because no one discusses any tragic tales of a dog lost in an accident that would create said spectral hound. So without a live animal preceding the ghost version, it's perhaps hard to call it a ghost at all, even though, as I say, some people call it a spectral hound. But it also probably doesn't fit with the mental picture that many people have of fairies, and that in itself is quite a loaded term, with the image of fairies altered so much over the centuries. The pranks of the Barguest and its often mischievous nature would seem to fit in more with other types of mischief-loving fairies. And in a lot of ways, its sudden appearance, marked by sound, and equally sudden disappearance without warning, isn't that dissimilar from the Silky. And indeed, its role as a death omen puts it in a similar category as the Benni or the Banshee. And if you're interested in the Banshee, I do have a bonus episode about them available to Patreon supporters. So perhaps the term Sprite, as broad as that is, fits the Barguest as best it can, and that way we can accept its strange behaviour, seemingly with no real endgame in mind, without thinking of the tales involving fairies, dangerous bargains and other fairy matters. But do just make sure that if you do see one, leave it alone, and hopefully it won't follow you home. So what I'd like to know is, what do you make of the Barguest? Do you think that it's more of a spectral hound, or do you think that it fits in more with this kind of broad category of fairies which has all kinds of different roles and responsibilities, like being a death omen, but then also just playing pranks on people just because? It's a strange one, but there we go. I'd love to know what you think. So again, if you're listening on YouTube, you can leave a comment below, and obviously please feel free to like and subscribe, and then obviously you'll get more notifications about these. If you're listening to the podcast version, you can always comment on the blog post that's linked in the show notes, or you can tweet me, or you can comment on the Facebook page for the podcast, or you can comment on Instagram, whatever you want. It's always nice to hear from people what their theories are, or indeed, if you have a family story involving the Barguest, I'd love to hear from that, because it's quite important to preserve these stories from people so that they don't just disappear. Anyway, next week we're going to look at a much more traditional type of fairy, which is the brownie, and I want to particularly focus on another local story, the Coal Ladder Hilton. So we're going to have a look at that next week. And yeah, I hope you're enjoying these different types of fairies as well. And we are going to be doing sort of witchy type things in June as well, so stay tuned for that. But anyway, I wish you a marvellous week ahead, and I will see you soon. Cheerio. Well, thanks for listening, and I hope you enjoyed that episode. If you did, feel free to leave a review wherever you listen to podcasts, because that helps other people find the show too. It also takes between 4 and 6 hours to research, write, record and edit these episodes, so if you want to help support my time in doing that, then you can buy me a coffee, or you can join the Fabulous Folklore family on Patreon and enjoy extra benefits, including exclusive episodes and articles and even illustrated talks. All the links you need are below, and thanks in advance.